When Maya Ivanova's designer pants were ripped away in front of the entire boardroom, everyone expected to see embarrassment and defeat. Instead, what they discovered on her lower back changed everything they thought they knew about the quiet girl from accounting and turned her into the most feared competitor in corporate Europe. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Financial's Prague headquarters as Maya Ivanova settled into her cramped cubicle on the third floor. At 24, she had been working in the accounts payable department for 18 months, arriving each day at exactly 7:45 a.m. with her carefully pressed blouses, modest skirts, and the same brown leather briefcase her grandmother had given her when she graduated from university. Maya's workspace was a study in meticulous organization. Color-coded folders lined her desk in perfect rows. Her computer monitor displayed 3 different spreadsheets simultaneously, and a small potted orchid, the only personal touch she allowed herself, sat beside her telephone. Her colleagues often joked that Maya could find a missing penny in $1 million budget, and they weren't wrong. She had an almost supernatural ability to track financial discrepancies, catching errors that senior accountants missed and reconciling accounts that others had given up on. "Morning, Maya," called out Petra Kowalski, the department supervisor, as she passed by with her usual stack of files. "I've got the Henderson Industries reconciliation for you. Third quarter numbers are a mess again." Maya nodded politely, accepting the thick folder without complaint. Henderson Industries was known throughout the company as a nightmare client. Their bookkeeping was chaotic, their documentation incomplete, and their payment schedules erratic. Most accountants in the department tried to avoid their files, but Maya had somehow become the unofficial Henderson specialist. Not because she'd volunteered, but because she was the only one who could consistently make sense of their financial chaos. As Petra walked away, Maya opened the folder and immediately spotted patterns that others had missed. The Henderson account wasn't just disorganized, it was deliberately complex, with layered transactions and subsidiary transfers that obscured the real financial picture. But Maya had always been good with puzzles, especially the kind that most people didn't even recognize as puzzles. She pulled up her personal tracking system, a complex spreadsheet she'd created that went far beyond what her job required. While her official duties involved processing invoices and maintaining accounts payable records, Maya had secretly been building comprehensive financial profiles of every major client. She tracked payment patterns, seasonal fluctuations, subsidiary relationships, and cash flow trends. It was work that belonged to the analysis department 3 floors up, but Maya found herself drawn to the bigger picture that her small piece of data helped create. The analysis department was where Maya really wanted to be. Those analysts earned 3 times her salary, worked on high-profile projects, and had the respect of senior management. They advised on mergers, identified investment opportunities, and shaped company strategy. Maya had applied for analyst positions 4 times in the past year, each application meticulously prepared with examples of her work and recommendations from clients who'd been impressed by her attention to detail. Each application had been politely rejected. "Maya's very thorough," her supervisor had explained during her last performance review. "But analysis work requires a different skill set. It's about strategic thinking, presentation skills, and the ability to work with senior executives. Maya is more suited to detail-oriented support work." The translation was clear. Maya was too quiet, too young, and too much of a back-office person to work with the executives upstairs. She didn't have the polish, the confidence, or the corporate presence that the analysis department required. She was good at finding other people's mistakes, but that didn't qualify her to advise on million-dollar decisions. Maya had accepted this assessment with her usual quiet dignity. But she'd also continued her unauthorized financial analysis work. Every evening after her official duties ended, she stayed late to build models and track patterns that fascinated her. She'd identified several concerning trends in client accounts, discovered potential opportunities for cost savings, and even spotted what appeared to be fraudulent transactions in a few high-profile accounts. But Maya kept these discoveries to herself. Previous attempts to share insights with supervisors had been met with polite dismissal or suggestions that she focus on her assigned tasks. She'd learned that being right about things outside your designated expertise was often viewed as presumptuous. Rather than helpful. As the morning progressed, Maya worked through the Henderson files with her characteristic precision. She identified 17 discrepancies, traced 6 suspicious transactions, and discovered a pattern of duplicate billing that had cost the company nearly 50,000 euros over the past quarter. She documented everything in her personal files, knowing that her official report would only include the basic reconciliation that her job required. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maya probably understood Meridian's client financial patterns better than anyone in the building, but she was considered qualified only to process their invoices. The quarterly company meeting was held in Meridian Financial's main conference room, an impressive space with mahogany tables and leather chairs that could accommodate the entire staff of nearly 200 employees. Maya sat in the back row with the other support staff, her notebook ready to record any information that might affect her departmental duties. The analysts and senior managers occupied the front rows, their expensive suits and confident postures marking them as the company's decision-makers. CEO Victor Brennan stood at the front of the room, his silver hair perfectly styled and his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Our third quarter results show concerning trends in several key client relationships, he announced, clicking through presentation slides that displayed financial charts and graphs. Client retention is down 12%, and we've lost 3 major accounts to competitors who somehow anticipated their needs better than we did. Maya shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She'd identified warning signs in all 3 of those accounts months ago: payment delays, reduced transaction volumes, and communication patterns that suggested growing dissatisfaction. She'd even drafted detailed analyses of each situation, complete with recommendations for retention strategies. But she'd never found the right channel to share this information with anyone who could act on it. Our analysis department is working overtime to understand these losses, Brennan continued, nodding toward the analysts in the front rows. But I want to hear from everyone. If anyone has insights about our client relationships, please don't hesitate to share them with your supervisors. Maya considered raising her hand, but the words of her last performance review echoed in her mind. Analysis work requires a different skill set: strategic thinking, presentation skills, the ability to work with senior executives. She glanced around at her fellow support staff, all of whom were quietly taking notes rather than preparing to contribute to the discussion. After the meeting, Maya approached her supervisor Petra with a carefully prepared summary of her observations about the lost clients. She'd spent her lunch break organizing her findings into clear, actionable recommendations. "Maya," Petra said with barely concealed impatience, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but these kinds of strategic insights are outside your area of expertise. The analysis department has advanced degrees and years of experience. They don't need input from accounts payable." "But I work with these accounts every day," Maya protested gently. "I see patterns in their payment behaviors, changes in their transaction volumes. Some of these warning signs were visible months ago." Petra's expression softened slightly, but her message remained firm. "I'm sure you notice things, but noticing and analyzing are different skills. The analysts upstairs have access to information. You don't see market research, industry trends, strategic planning documents. Your observations might seem significant to you, but they're just small pieces of a much larger puzzle. Maya nodded and returned to her desk, but the dismissal stung more than usual. She pulled up her private files and reviewed the detailed analyses she prepared for each lost client. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her recommendations had been specific and actionable. Adjusted payment terms for Henderson Industries, expanded service offerings for Novak Manufacturing, and proactive communication strategies for Baltic shipping. Any one of these approaches might have prevented the client defections that were now costing the company millions. The pattern of dismissal wasn't new. 6 months earlier, Maya had identified suspicious transactions in the Korvac Industries account that suggested potential money laundering. She'd spent weeks tracing the patterns, documenting shell company connections, and building what she believed was compelling evidence of financial crimes. When she'd finally gathered the courage to present her findings to Petra, she'd been told that fraud detection is handled by our compliance department, not by junior accountants. 2 weeks later, Korvac Industries had been raided by financial investigators and several executives had been arrested. The news reports mentioned suspicious transaction patterns identical to what Maya had discovered. But by then her documentation had been forgotten and her insights had gone uncredited. Maya had also tried to contribute during department meetings, offering suggestions for improving client service processes or identifying cost-saving opportunities. Her ideas were consistently met with polite nods and immediate subject changes. Her colleagues weren't hostile. They simply didn't view her as someone whose strategic input mattered. The most frustrating part was watching the analysis department struggle with problems that Maya had already solved. She'd created predictive models for client behavior, developed algorithms for identifying at-risk accounts, and designed early warning systems for financial irregularities. But this work remained hidden in her personal files because sharing it would be seen as overstepping her boundaries. During her annual review, Maya had asked directly about advancement opportunities. What would it take for me to be considered for an analyst position? Her department head, Director Klaus Weber, had smiled condescendingly. Maya, you're excellent at what you do, but analysis work requires a different temperament. You need to be comfortable presenting to senior executives, defending your recommendations, and handling high-pressure situations. You're more of a behind-the-scenes person. There's nothing wrong with that. We need reliable people in support roles. The subtext was clear. Maya was too quiet, too unassuming, and too lacking in executive presence to be trusted with important decisions. She could find the errors, but she couldn't be the one to explain their significance to people who mattered. Maya had accepted this limitation with her characteristic grace. But she'd also made a decision. If her insights weren't valued through official channels, she would continue developing them privately. Someday, she told herself, an opportunity would arise to demonstrate that. Competence didn't always come with the expected packaging. She just hadn't expected that opportunity to arrive in such a dramatic and public way. The whispers started during Maya's second year at Meridian Financial. Subtle at first but growing more pointed with each passing month. It began when senior analyst Thomas Richter noticed Maya working late again, her computer screen filled with complex financial models that bore no resemblance to standard accounts payable work. What exactly is Maya doing up there so late every night? Thomas asked Director Klaus Weber during their weekly staff meeting. I walked past her desk yesterday at 9 p.m. and she was building what looked like predictive analytics models. That's not accounts payable work. Weber frowned, making a note in his planner. I'll speak with Petra about keeping her team focused on their assigned duties. The conversation filtered down through management layers until it reached Maya in the form of a seemingly casual comment from Petra. Maya, I've noticed you've been staying quite late recently. I hope you're not overworking yourself with extra projects. Maya assured her supervisor that she was simply being thorough with her assigned tasks. But the message was clear. Her intellectual curiosity was being viewed as a problem rather than an asset. She began staying later and arriving earlier to avoid scrutiny, working on her analysis during hours when the building was nearly empty. But her efforts to remain invisible backfired. Security reports showed that Maya was accessing the building outside normal hours more frequently than any other employee. Her computer usage logs revealed that she was accessing databases and financial systems far beyond what her job required. To executives who didn't understand her work, these patterns looked suspicious rather than dedicated. "I'm concerned about Maya Ivanova," Director Weber told CEO Victor Brennan during their monthly security briefing. "She's exhibiting unusual behavior patterns, extended hours, unauthorized database access, work product that goes far beyond her job description. It's raising flags." Brennan, who barely knew Maya existed, nodded seriously. "What kind of flags?" "The kind that suggests someone might be gathering information for purposes outside their legitimate job functions." Weber replied carefully. "She could be building a portfolio to take to competitors, or worse, she could be involved in corporate espionage." The suggestion was absurd to anyone who knew Maya. But Brennan didn't know Maya. He knew only that a low-level employee was exhibiting behavior that security deemed suspicious. Within days, Maya found herself subjected to increased scrutiny that she didn't initially understand. Her computer access was quietly restricted, limiting her ability to view historical data that she'd previously used for her analysis work. Her badge was flagged for monitoring, recording every door she accessed and every hour she spent in the building. Most significantly, her work was subjected to additional review layers that slowed her productivity and made her supervisors question her efficiency. "Maya," Petra said during a tense meeting, "your processing times have increased significantly over the past month. Are you having difficulty with your workload?" Maya wanted to explain that the additional review requirements and restricted access were slowing her down, but she sensed that defending herself would only make things worse. "I'll work on improving my efficiency," she said quietly. The isolation deepened when her colleagues began to distance themselves from her. Office gossip had a way of spreading through Meridian Financial like wildfire, and the word was that Maya was under some kind of management scrutiny. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who might be in trouble. Rachel Svoboda, who had been Maya's closest work friend, stopped joining her for coffee breaks. "I'm just really busy lately," Rachel explained when Maya asked if everything was all right. But Maya noticed that Rachel found time for coffee with other colleagues. During department meetings, Maya's suggestions were met with increasingly cold responses. When she pointed out a potential issue with the Novak manufacturing account, Thomas Richter interrupted her with barely concealed irritation. "Maya, I think we should focus on your assigned responsibilities, rather than speculating about accounts that aren't your concern," he said, his tone sharp enough to make the entire room uncomfortable. Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But she also felt something else, a growing anger at being treated like a problem rather than a resource. She'd identified genuine issues that could save the company money and prevent client losses, but her insights were being dismissed not on their merits but because of who she was and what others perceived her motives to be. The breaking point came when Maya discovered irregularities in the Baltic shipping account that suggested systematic fraud. The patterns were clear to her: inflated invoices, duplicate charges, and payment routing that obscured the trail of money. She spent days documenting the evidence, building a case that she believed was irrefutable. But when she attempted to report her findings, she was told that fraud investigations were handled exclusively by the compliance department, and that her unauthorized analysis of client accounts was inappropriate for someone in her position. "Maya," Director Weber said, during what he termed a guidance meeting, I need you to understand that your role here is to process transactions, not to investigate them. This kind of detective work you've been doing is outside your scope of authority, and it's creating concerns about your judgment. Maya left the meeting feeling like she'd been slapped. Her competence was being reframed as poor judgment, her dedication as inappropriate ambition. She was being systematically pushed into a smaller and smaller box, told to limit herself to the narrow tasks that others had decided represented her proper place in the company hierarchy. That evening, Maya sat in her small apartment, reviewing the fraud evidence she'd uncovered. The patterns were undeniable, the financial impact was significant, and the legal implications were serious. But she was being told that noticing these problems was somehow inappropriate for someone like her. For the first time since joining Meridian Financial, Maya seriously considered looking for another job. But she also realized that running away wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. Somehow she needed to prove that competence and insight didn't depend on job titles or management approval. She just didn't know that opportunity would arrive sooner than she expected, in a way that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the corporate world. Maya's apartment in Prague's Vinohrady district was modest by most standards, a one-bedroom space with outdated furniture and a kitchen barely large enough for one person. But what made it extraordinary was what Maya had created in her spare bedroom, which she'd converted into what could only be described as a financial war room. 3 large monitors dominated one wall, connected to a custom-built computer system that Maya had assembled herself using savings from 2 years of careful budgeting. The screens displayed real-time financial data, market trends, and the complex analytical models that Maya had been developing during her off hours. Financial textbooks in 4 languages lined makeshift shelves, alongside printed research papers that Maya had downloaded and studied during countless late nights. The centerpiece of the room was a massive whiteboard, covered in Maya's handwriting flowcharts, showing corporate relationships, timelines tracking suspicious financial patterns, and mathematical formulas that would have impressed graduate students at the Prague School of Economics. This was where Maya conducted the real work that her day job never allowed her to pursue. Maya had always been gifted with numbers, but her true talent lay in pattern recognition and systems thinking. While her colleagues at Meridian Financial processed transactions individually, Maya saw the connections between seemingly unrelated financial events. She could trace money flows across multiple companies, identify seasonal patterns in client behavior, and predict cash flow problems months before they became critical. Her educational background was more impressive than most people realized. Maya had graduated summa cum laude from Charles University, with degrees in both finance and computer science, writing her thesis on algorithmic fraud detection in European banking systems. She spoke 5 languages fluently and had completed advanced coursework in forensic accounting, corporate law, and international finance. But her quiet demeanor and support role position led most people to assume she was simply a competent but unremarkable accounting clerk. The truth was that Maya had been preparing for opportunities that didn't yet exist at Meridian Financial. Every evening after work, she studied advanced financial analysis techniques, practiced presentation skills using online courses, and built sophisticated models that demonstrated her analytical capabilities. She'd earned 3 professional certifications in her spare time, including a certified fraud examiner, credential that required extensive study and examination. Maya's real specialty was forensic financial analysis, the ability to detect and document financial crimes through pattern analysis and data modeling. She developed her own proprietary algorithms for identifying suspicious transactions, and her detection rates were significantly higher than industry standards. What made her approach unique was her combination of technical skills, linguistic abilities, and intuitive understanding of human behavior patterns. The Baltic shipping case that had recently been dismissed by her Supervisors was actually the culmination of 6 months of careful investigation. Maya had identified the fraud through subtle patterns in payment timing, invoice numbering, and subsidiary relationships. She'd traced the money through shell companies registered in 3 different countries, documented the systematic overbilling scheme, and calculated that the fraud had cost Meridian Financial approximately 2.3 million euros over 18 months. But Maya's preparation went far beyond individual cases. She'd been building a comprehensive database of client financial patterns, tracking early warning indicators for account problems, and developing predictive models for client retention. Her analysis had identified 12 clients who were at high risk of defection, 7 accounts showing signs of financial distress, and 3 potential fraud cases that warranted immediate investigation. Maya had also been preparing herself professionally in ways that her colleagues couldn't see. She'd joined professional organizations, attended virtual conferences, and built a network of contacts in the forensic accounting field. She'd even been invited to present a paper at an international conference on financial crime detection, though she'd had to decline because taking time off work would have drawn unwanted attention. Her language skills were particularly valuable in her analytical work. Maya could read and analyze financial documents in Czech, German, English, Russian, and Polish, giving her access to source materials that other analysts couldn't interpret. This had been crucial in several of her investigations where key evidence was buried in foreign language subsidiary reports or international banking communications. Maya had also been developing her presentation and communication skills, recognizing that technical competence alone wouldn't be enough to advance her career. She'd completed online courses in executive communication, data visualization, and strategic presentation techniques. She practiced explaining complex financial concepts in simple terms, preparing for the day when she might have the opportunity to present her findings to senior management. The most ambitious project in Maya's home office was a comprehensive analysis of Meridian Financial's competitive position and strategic opportunities. She'd spent months researching industry trends, analyzing competitor strategies, and identifying potential growth areas. Her conclusions challenged several assumptions that guided company strategy, and her recommendations could potentially increase annual revenue by 15 to 20%. But all of this preparation remained hidden, locked away in Maya's spare bedroom like a secret identity that she couldn't reveal without risking her job security. She'd learned that being too knowledgeable, too prepared, or too ambitious was viewed as suspicious rather than admirable in her current environment. Maya often wondered if she was wasting her talents, if she should look for opportunities at companies that would value her skills more appropriately. But she'd also developed a stubborn determination to prove herself at Meridian Financial, to demonstrate that competence could emerge from unexpected places. As she sat in her war room reviewing the latest patterns in the Henderson Industries account, Maya had no idea that all of her hidden preparation was about to be put to the ultimate test. The crisis that would finally give her a chance to prove herself was already developing, building toward a moment that would expose not just her abilities, but the physical evidence of just how far she'd been willing to go to become the financial detective that Meridian Financial desperately needed, but refused to recognize. The emergency board meeting was called for 2 p.m. on a sunny Thursday afternoon, but Maya didn't learn about it until she overheard Petra whispering urgently into her phone. The words regulatory investigation, frozen accounts, and potential criminal charges drifted across the office space like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything. Maya pretended to focus on her Henderson Industries reconciliation while straining to catch more details. What she heard made her blood run cold. European Financial Crimes Authority investigators had arrived that morning with warrants to examine Meridian Financial's books. Multiple client accounts had been frozen pending investigation, and preliminary findings suggested systematic fraud involving several major clients. This could destroy us, Petra was saying quietly. If they find what they're looking for, the company won't survive the scandal. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up her private files. The fraud patterns she'd been tracking in the Baltic Shipping, Corvec Industries, and Henderson Industries accounts weren't just academic exercises. They were real crimes that were apparently significant enough to attract international attention. The evidence she'd been quietly documenting in her spare bedroom might be exactly what the company needed to defend itself. The afternoon brought a parade of investigators, lawyers, and senior executives moving through the building like storm clouds. Maya watched from her cubicle as boxes of documents were collected from various departments. Computers were seized for analysis, and employees were escorted to private meetings with regulatory officials. At 4 p.m., CEO Victor Brennan's voice echoed through the building's intercom system. All staff members are to remain at their workstations until further notice. We are cooperating fully with ongoing regulatory review, and we ask for your patience during this process. Maya noticed that the analysis department was in chaos. Senior analysts huddled in conference rooms with their lawyers, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Thomas Richter looked particularly shaken, clutching a folder of documents and speaking rapidly with Director Weber, whatever the investigators were looking for. It was clear that the company's official financial analysis systems had failed to detect it. The opportunity Maya had been unconsciously preparing for was presenting itself in the most dramatic way possible. She had detailed documentation of the fraud patterns that investigators were apparently discovering, along with predictive models that could help identify additional compromised accounts. But revealing this information would require admitting that she'd been conducting unauthorized financial investigations for months. Maya spent an hour weighing her options. She could remain silent and let the investigation proceed without her input, protecting her job security but potentially watching the company collapse. Or she could risk everything by revealing the extent of her hidden analytical work, knowing that it would either save Meridian Financial or destroy her career. Decision was made for her when she overheard a conversation between two investigators near the elevator. They were discussing their frustration with the company's inadequate documentation and their inability to trace the full scope of the fraud schemes they'd uncovered. The official analysis is superficial, one investigator was saying. They've got spreadsheets and summaries, but nothing that shows the actual money flows or subsidiary relationships. It's like they never looked beyond the surface level. Maya stood up from her desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She walked to the elevator where the investigators were waiting, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I'm Maya Ivanova from Accounts Payable. I believe I have information that might be relevant to your investigation." The investigators looked at her skeptically. Maya was 24 years old, wearing a modest blouse and carrying a notebook that looked like it belonged to a university student. She was exactly the kind of junior employee that investigators typically dismissed as irrelevant to complex financial crimes. "What kind of information?" one of them asked, his tone polite but uninterested. "Detailed transaction analysis showing systematic fraud patterns in Baltic Shipping, Henderson Industries, and Corvec Industries accounts," Maya replied, "including money flow documentation, shell company identification, and estimated financial impact calculations." The investigators exchanged glances. These were exactly the accounts they'd been investigating, and the level of detail Maya was describing exceeded what they'd found in the company's official records. "And you have this information because—" the second investigator prompted. Maya took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Because I've been conducting forensic financial analysis of these accounts for the past 8 months. I have comprehensive documentation that shows how the fraud schemes operate and who's responsible for implementing them." The investigator's casual interest transformed into sharp attention. Maya had just claimed to possess exactly the kind of detailed evidence that could make or break their investigation. "We'll need to see this documentation immediately," the first investigator said. "Where is it located?" Maya's heart sank as she realized the full implications of what she'd just offered. The evidence that could save Meridian Financial was locked in her apartment, in a secret war room that proved she'd been conducting unauthorized investigations for months. Revealing it would expose the full extent of her hidden activities and potentially end her career, even if it saved the company. But there was no turning back now. Maya had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Most of it is at my home," she said quietly. "I can have it here within 2 hours." As Maya walked back to her desk to collect her things, she noticed that several colleagues were watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Her conversation with the investigators hadn't gone unnoticed, and word was already spreading that the quiet girl from accounts payable had information relevant to the criminal investigation. Maya gathered her personal items and headed for the exit, knowing that when she returned with her documentation, everything would be different. She just hadn't expected that the moment of revelation would be quite so public or quite so dramatic as what was about to unfold. Maya returned to Meridian Financial at 6 p.m., carrying 2 large briefcases and a laptop bag, her evidence carefully organized in the folders and digital files that represented months of painstaking investigation. The building buzzed with tension as investigators, lawyers, and senior management worked through the evening to address the regulatory crisis that threatened to destroy the company. She'd called ahead to inform the investigators that she had the documentation they'd requested. But what she found waiting for her was more complicated than she'd expected. The main conference room had been converted into a command center, with investigators, company executives, and legal representatives gathered around tables covered with financial documents and computer printouts. CEO Victor Brennan looked up as Maya entered, his expression shifting from hope to skepticism as he took in her appearance. Maya realized that to him, she was still just a junior accounting clerk claiming to have information that his senior analysts had missed. "Ms. Ivanova," Brennan said carefully, "I understand you believe you have relevant information for the investigators. Before we proceed, I need to understand exactly what you've been doing and why you have access to documentation that our official analysis didn't uncover." Maya set her briefcases on the table and pulled out the first folder, her hands steady, despite the dozen pairs of eyes focused on her. "I've been conducting forensic analysis of suspicious transaction patterns in my spare time," she said. "I identified several accounts showing signs of systematic fraud and documented the evidence in case it became relevant." Director Klaus Weber stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Ms. Ivanova, are you telling us that you've been conducting unauthorized investigations of client accounts? That you've been accessing financial data beyond your job requirements and building files without management approval?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Maya realized that her attempt to help was being reframed as potentially criminal behavior by the very people she was trying to assist. "I used only information that was available through my regular job duties," Maya replied. "I simply analyzed it more comprehensively than my position required." "That's exactly the problem," Weber continued. "You exceeded your authority, conducted analysis work without proper oversight, and created documentation that could compromise client confidentiality. This is a serious breach of protocol." Thomas Richter, who had been silent until now, spoke up with barely concealed hostility. "How do we know that this isn't some kind of elaborate scheme? Maya's been acting suspiciously for months, staying late, accessing databases she doesn't need, asking questions about accounts outside her responsibility. Now she conveniently has evidence of crimes that our professional analysts missed." The room erupted in murmured conversations as executives and investigators processed this suggestion. Maya felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time the stakes were infinitely higher. Her competence was being questioned not just for promotion purposes, but as potential evidence of criminal intent. Are you suggesting that I fabricated evidence of fraud? Maya asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. I'm suggesting that your behavior has been highly irregular, Richter replied. And now you're asking us to trust analysis from someone who has been conducting secret investigations without authorization. How do we know you haven't manipulated data to make yourself look important? One of the investigators, Agent Sarah Mueller, stepped forward with professional calm. These are serious allegations on both sides, she said. Ms. Ivanova, we need to examine your documentation to determine its authenticity and relevance. But first, I need to understand your qualifications for conducting this type of analysis. Maya felt a moment of relief. Finally, someone was asking about her capabilities rather than questioning her motives. I have degrees in finance and computer science from Charles University, plus certifications in forensic accounting and fraud examination. I've been developing specialized skills in financial crime detection. Weber laughed dismissively. Ms. Ivanova is a junior accounting clerk with 18 months of experience processing invoices. She has no training in forensic analysis, no supervision, and no authority to conduct the kind of investigation she's describing. Actually, Maya said quietly, pulling out her certification documents, I'm a certified fraud examiner with advanced training in financial crime detection. My analysis methods are consistent with international standards for forensic accounting. The room fell silent as Weber examined the credentials, his expression shifting from dismissive to confused. Maya's qualifications were significantly more impressive than anyone had realized, but that only made her unauthorized investigations seem more deliberate and potentially problematic. Agent Mueller examined the documents and nodded approvingly. These are legitimate credentials, she confirmed. Ms. Ivanova is qualified to conduct the type of analysis she's describing. But CEO Brennan was not satisfied. Qualified or not, she conducted unauthorized investigations of client accounts. She violated company policy, exceeded her job authority, and created potential legal liabilities. Even if her information is accurate, her methods were completely inappropriate. Maya realized that she was caught in an impossible situation. Her evidence could save the company, but revealing it proved that she'd been violating company policy for months. Her qualifications supported her credibility, but they also suggested that her unauthorized work was more deliberate than accidental. Mr. Brennan, Agent Mueller said diplomatically, given the serious nature of our investigation, I think we should examine Ms. Ivanova's documentation before making judgments about her methods. If her analysis is accurate, it could be crucial to resolving this matter. Brennan looked around the room at the faces of his senior staff, most of whom were expressing skepticism about trusting their company's future to the unauthorized work of a junior employee. Maya could see the calculation in his eyes. Even if her evidence was valuable, using it would mean admitting that their official systems had failed while their most junior employee had succeeded. Very well, Brennan said finally. Let's see what Ms. Ivanova has discovered. But I want it understood that her methods are being investigated separately from the content of her findings. Maya opened her first briefcase, revealing hundreds of pages of meticulously organized documentation. As she began explaining her analysis, she noticed that the skeptical expressions around the room were beginning to change to something resembling amazement. What Maya didn't know was that her real test was yet to come, and it would require revealing not just her intellectual capabilities, but the physical evidence of just how far she'd been willing to go to uncover the truth. As Maya began presenting her fraud analysis to the room full of investigators and executives, the initial amazement at her thoroughness quickly transformed into something darker. Her documentation was too detailed, her evidence too comprehensive, and her insights too sophisticated for what anyone expected from a junior accounting clerk. Instead of earning respect, Maya's competence was breeding suspicion. This level of analysis would have required hundreds of hours of work, Agent Mueller observed, flipping through Maya's meticulously organized files. When exactly did you conduct this investigation, Miss Ivanova? Maya felt the room's attention sharpen as she realized the implications of the question. I worked on it during my off hours, she replied carefully. Evenings, weekends, lunch breaks. When possible. Director Klaus Weber leaned forward, his expression skeptical. Miss Ivanova, you're telling us that you spent hundreds of unpaid hours investigating client accounts that weren't your responsibility, using company resources and databases, without any authorization or oversight. The way Weber framed it made Maya's dedication sound almost pathological. She could see doubt spreading across the faces around the conference table like ripples in water. Her evidence was impressive, but her methods were beginning to look obsessive rather than admirable. I was concerned about patterns I was noticing in the accounts I processed, Maya explained. I thought someone should investigate them. But, not you, Thomas Richter interjected sharply. You're not qualified to make those determinations, and you certainly weren't authorized to conduct surveillance of client financial activities. What you're describing sounds more like corporate espionage than legitimate analysis. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. Corporate espionage. I was trying to protect the company from fraud. Were you? CEO Victor Brennan asked, his tone dangerously quiet. Or were you gathering sensitive financial information for purposes we don't understand? Ms. Ivanova, you've admitted to conducting unauthorized investigations, accessing databases beyond your clearance level, and building comprehensive files on client financial activities. From a security perspective, this is extremely concerning. Behavior. The room fell silent as the implications of Brennan's words settled over everyone present. Maya realized with growing horror that her attempt to help was being reinterpreted as potential criminal activity. Her competence was being used as evidence against her rather than proof of her value to the company. Agent Mueller consulted her notes, her professional demeanor masking whatever conclusions she was drawing. Ms. Ivanova, our preliminary review of your documentation suggests that you had access to information that should have been restricted. Can you explain how you obtained detailed subsidiary financial records for companies like Baltic Shipping? Maya's stomach dropped. She'd used her database access and language skills to trace connections through international subsidiaries, work that had required creativity and persistence, but hadn't involved breaking any security protocols. But explaining this would reveal just how extensively she'd been investigating accounts beyond her official responsibilities. I used publicly available filings and cross-referenced them with transaction patterns visible in our internal systems, Maya replied. It required connecting information from multiple sources, but I didn't access anything that wasn't available through my regular job functions. Weber laughed dismissively. Miss Ivanova, what you're describing is sophisticated financial intelligence work, the kind of analysis that requires security clearance and management approval. You can't seriously expect us to believe that you accidentally stumbled across evidence of international fraud schemes while processing invoices. Maya realized she was trapped in a circular logic that made her competence itself evidence of wrongdoing. If her analysis was accurate, it proved she'd exceeded her authority. If her methods were sophisticated, it suggested premeditation. If her evidence was comprehensive, it indicated potential security breaches. I think we need to step back and consider what we're really dealing with here, Brennan said, addressing the investigators directly. We have a junior employee who has been conducting unauthorized surveillance of client accounts, gathering sensitive financial information, and building comprehensive intelligence files. She claims this was done to help the company, but her methods are consistent with corporate espionage activities. The investigators exchanged glances, clearly processing the security implications of Maya's activities. Agent Mueller made notes, while her colleague, Agent Fisher studied Maya with the cold assessment of someone trained to identify threats. "Ms. Ivanova," Fisher said carefully, "I need to ask you directly. Have you shared this information with anyone outside Meridian? Financial? Have you been in contact with competitors, journalists, or regulatory agencies prior to today?" The question hit Maya like a physical blow. She was being investigated not as a potential asset, but as a possible security threat. Her months of unpaid work to protect the company were being twisted into evidence that she might be working against it. "No," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the anger and hurt building inside her. "I've shared this information with no one. Everything I've done has been intended to help Meridian Financial identify and prevent fraud." Weber stood up and began pacing, his agitation evident. "The problem, Ms. Ivanova, is that we only have your word for that. You've demonstrated a pattern of deceptive behavior conducting secret investigations, exceeding your authority, accessing sensitive information without authorization. How can we trust that your motives are what you claim they are?" Maya looked around the room at faces that had transformed from curious to suspicious to openly hostile. Her colleagues who had once dismissed her as too small and insignificant now viewed her as potentially dangerous. Her evidence, which could save the company millions and prevent regulatory disaster, was being overshadowed by questions about her loyalty and intentions. "I understand that my methods were irregular," Maya said quietly. "But my findings are accurate, and they're exactly what you need to resolve this investigation. Whether you trust my motives or not, the evidence speaks for itself." Agent Mueller closed Maya's files and exchanged a meaningful look with her colleague. "Ms. Ivanova, we're going to need to examine your evidence more thoroughly, but we're also going to need to investigate how you obtained it. This meeting is suspended pending a full security review." As investigators and executives filed out of the conference room, Maya remained seated at the table, surrounded by her documentation. She'd offered everything she had to save the company, only to find herself under investigation as a potential security threat. Her competence had become her liability, and her dedication had been reframed as deception. Maya gathered her files slowly, knowing that when this was over, her career at Meridian Financial would be finished regardless of whether her evidence proved valuable. She'd crossed too many lines and revealed too much about her unauthorized activities to ever return to her quiet life in accounts payable. But what hurt most was the realization that even when she'd proven herself capable of exactly the kind of work the company needed, they still couldn't see her as anything other than a problem to be solved. 3 days of investigation had transformed Maya from a potential company savior into its most scrutinized employee. While investigators validated her fraud evidence, confirming that her analysis was not only accurate but more comprehensive than anything their official systems had produced, Maya herself had been placed under what amounted to corporate house arrest. Her computer access had been completely revoked, her desk had been searched, and security had been instructed to monitor her movements within the building. Most humiliatingly, she'd been reassigned to a conference room where she was required to remain under supervision while investigators determined whether her unauthorized activities constituted a security breach or potential criminal behavior. Maya sat in the sterile conference room, reviewing printed copies of her own work, documents that investigators were now treating as evidence in a case where she was as much suspect as witness. Through the glass walls, she could see her former colleagues whispering and glancing in her direction. The woman who had once been invisible had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The irony was devastating. Maya's fraud analysis had identified over €4 million in criminal losses and provided investigators with detailed roadmaps for recovering stolen funds. Her work had potentially saved Meridian Financial from regulatory sanctions that could have destroyed the company. But instead of recognition, she faced the very real possibility of criminal charges for conducting unauthorized financial investigations. Director Klaus Weber entered the conference room carrying a folder that Maya recognized as her personnel file. His expression was a mixture of frustration and something that might have been regret, though Maya couldn't be sure. "Ms. Ivanova," Weber began, settling into the chair across from her. "I want you to understand the situation we're facing. Here, your analysis has been invaluable to the investigation. The regulators have confirmed that your evidence is accurate and comprehensive. But your methods have created serious legal and security concerns." Maya nodded, having expected this conversation. "For days, what kind of concerns?" Weber opened her personnel file and consulted several documents. "The investigation has revealed that you accessed client databases 847 times, outside normal business hours over the past 8 months. You viewed financial records for 73 client accounts that weren't assigned to your department. You downloaded and analyzed transaction data totaling over 2.3 terabytes of information. From a data security perspective, your activities are indistinguishable from corporate espionage." The numbers were staggering even to Maya, who hadn't realized how extensive her investigation had become. Each late evening and weekend session had added to a pattern that now looked damning when viewed collectively. "I was investigating fraud." "Patterns," Maya said quietly. "Everything I accessed was related to potential criminal activity." "But you made that determination unilaterally," Weber replied. "You decided which accounts were suspicious, which patterns were worth investigating, and which evidence was relevant. Those aren't decisions that junior employees are authorized to make, regardless of their qualifications." Maya felt familiar anger building in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something newer. Deep exhaustion with constantly having to justify her competence to people who refused to recognize it. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying an edge that surprised both of them, "if I had followed proper channels, if I had limited myself to my assigned duties, if I had waited for authorization from people who clearly didn't understand the significance of what I was seeing, this company would be facing criminal charges and regulatory sanctions that could have destroyed it entirely." Weber's expression hardened. "That's not your decision to make, Ms. Ivanova. We have procedures and hierarchies for a reason. You can't simply ignore the chain of command because you think you know better than your supervisors." "My supervisors dismissed every concern I raised," Maya replied, her composure beginning to crack. "They told me to focus on my assigned tasks while millions of euros were being stolen from accounts I was processing. They questioned my motives when I tried to share insights that could have prevented client losses. At what point was I supposed to prioritize company procedures over preventing actual crimes?" The conference room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of office activity. Weber studied Maya with an expression she couldn't read, while Maya fought to regain control of emotions that months of frustration had pushed to the breaking point. "Ms. Ivanova," Weber said finally, "I understand your frustration, but your behavior has created an impossible situation. We can't reward unauthorized investigations, regardless of their results, because doing so would essentially give every employee permission to ignore company policies whenever they disagree with management decisions." Maya realized that she was facing the fundamental contradiction that had shaped her entire experience at Meridian Financial. Her competence was valued only when it remained safely contained within the narrow boundaries that others had established for her. The moment her abilities exceeded those limitations, they became a problem rather than an asset. "So what happens now?" Maya asked. Weber closed her personnel file and looked directly at her. "The regulatory investigation has been resolved thanks to your evidence. The company will avoid criminal charges and regulatory sanctions, but your employment here cannot continue. We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package and positive references, but your position at Meridian Financial is terminated, effective immediately." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd saved the company and lost her job in the same week. Her competence had finally been recognized, but only as part of the process of removing her from the organization she'd tried to protect. "I see," Maya said quietly. "And if I refuse the severance package?" Weber's expression grew uncomfortable. "Then we pursue disciplinary action for policy violations, data security breaches, and conducting unauthorized investigations of client accounts. Ms. Ivanova, I would strongly recommend accepting our offer." Maya stood up and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the Prague skyline that had become as familiar as her own reflection over the past 2 years. Somewhere in those buildings were companies that might value her skills appropriately, organizations that might see her unauthorized investigation as evidence of initiative rather than insubordination. But leaving Meridian Financial like this felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that her competence would always be viewed as a threat rather than an asset by people who couldn't imagine that excellence might emerge from unexpected places. Maya turned back to Weber, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I decline your offer," she said. "If you want to pursue disciplinary action against someone who saved your company from criminal charges, then do it publicly. Let everyone see how Meridian Financial treats employees who go above and beyond to protect the organization." Weber's face went pale. "Ms. Ivanova, I don't think you understand the consequences of what you're saying." Maya smiled for the first time in days, though there was no humor in it. "Actually, Director Weber, I think I understand the consequences better than you do. The question is whether you're prepared to explain to regulators, investigators, and the media why you're punishing the employee whose unauthorized work saved your company." For the first time since joining Meridian Financial, Maya felt like she held the stronger position in a confrontation with management. But what she didn't know was that her real moment of truth was still coming, and it would reveal not just her intellectual courage, but the physical evidence of just how far she'd been willing to go to uncover the truth that everyone else had missed. Maya's refusal to accept the severance package created a standoff that neither she nor Meridian Financial's management had anticipated. For 2 weeks, she remained in corporate limbo, officially suspended pending disciplinary review, but effectively trapped in a legal and bureaucratic maze that nobody seemed sure how to resolve. The situation became more complicated when word of Maya's role in exposing the fraud began to leak beyond the company's walls. Financial journalists had picked up rumors about a junior employee whose unauthorized investigation had saved a major Prague financial firm from regulatory disaster. The story was too compelling to ignore. A quiet accounting clerk who had single-handedly uncovered millions in fraud while her superiors dismissed her concerns. Maya received her first interview request on a Tuesday morning, followed by 3 more before lunch. Reporters wanted to know about the whistleblower accountant, whose secret investigation had exposed international financial crimes. The attention was flattering but also terrifying. Maya had never sought publicity, and the prospect of becoming a public figure felt overwhelming. But what made the situation truly explosive was Maya's realization that she could control the narrative. For months, she'd been defined by other people's perceptions of her limitations and capabilities. Now, for the first time, she had the opportunity to tell her own story on her own terms. Maya declined all interview requests initially, but she began documenting her experience in detail. She wrote about the pattern of dismissal she'd faced, the systematic underestimation of her capabilities, and the bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented her from sharing crucial information through official channels. Her account was methodical, factual, and devastating in its implications for how Meridian Financial managed talent and handled security threats. The breaking point came when Maya learned that the company was preparing to file criminal charges against her for unauthorized access to client data. The charges were serious enough to potentially result in prison time, and Maya realized that her former employer was willing to destroy her life to avoid admitting that their official systems had failed while her unauthorized work had succeeded. Maya made her decision on a Friday afternoon, calling the most persistent journalist who had been seeking an interview. "My name is Maya Ivanova," she said. "I'm the employee whose investigation exposed the fraud at Meridian Financial. I'm ready to tell my story." The interview was scheduled for the following Monday at a neutral location, a conference room at a downtown Prague hotel. Maya spent the weekend preparing her materials, organizing her evidence, and mentally rehearsing the story she was about to make public. She knew that once she spoke to the media, there would be no possibility of returning to her quiet life at Meridian Financial. But Maya had also reached a point where protecting her career mattered less than proving a larger point about competence, recognition, and the cost of systematic underestimation. If Meridian Financial was prepared to prosecute her for saving the company, then she was prepared to let the public judge who was really acting in bad faith. The journalist who met Maya on Monday morning, Helena Novikova, a respected financial reporter whose investigations had exposed several high-profile corporate scandals. Helena was professional but clearly skeptical. She'd covered enough corporate disputes to know that disgruntled employees often presented one-sided accounts of complex situations. "Ms. Ivanova," Helena began, "I understand you believe you were treated unfairly by Meridian Financial after conducting what you describe as fraud investigation. But the company's position is that you violated data security protocols and exceeded your job authority. How do you respond to those concerns?" Maya had expected this question and had prepared her answer carefully. She pulled out a timeline sheet, created showing her attempts to report suspicious patterns through official channels, the dismissal she'd received, and the escalating severity of the fraud that continued while her concerns were ignored. "Ms. Novikova," Maya replied, "I tried for months to share my concerns through proper channels. I was told repeatedly that analysis work was outside my expertise and that I should focus on my assigned duties. Meanwhile, millions of euros were being stolen from accounts that I was processing every day." Helena examined Maya's documentation, her expression growing more interested as she reviewed the evidence. "This is quite comprehensive," she observed. "How much time did you spend on this investigation?" "Hundreds of hours over 8 months, Maya replied. "Every evening, most weekends, any free time I could find. I couldn't stand watching these crimes continue while everyone told me it wasn't my job to notice them." The interview continued for 2 hours with Helena asking increasingly detailed questions about Maya's background, her investigative methods, and her treatment by Meridian Financial Management. Maya answered everything honestly, providing documentation to support her claims and acknowledging the irregular nature of her actions while defending their necessity. But the most powerful moment came when Helena asked about Maya's motivations for conducting such extensive unauthorized work. Maya's answer was simple and direct. Someone had to care enough to look deeper than the surface. If that someone had to be me, working alone in my spare time without permission or recognition, then that's what it took. As the interview concluded, Helena asked one final question that would prove more significant than either of them realized at the time. "Ms. Ivanova, given everything you've been through, do you regret conducting this investigation?" Maya's response was immediate and definitive. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the company's official systems failed so completely that a junior employee had to spend her own time preventing millions in fraud losses. But I don't regret doing the work that needed to be done, regardless of whether anyone wanted to acknowledge its value." The interview ended with Maya feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely liberated. For the first time since joining Meridian Financial, she'd been able to tell her complete story without interruption, dismissal, or reinterpretation by people who couldn't understand her capabilities. Helena promised to fact-check Maya's claims with company officials and regulatory investigators before publishing her story. Maya knew that once the article appeared, her quiet life would be over permanently. But she also knew that some battles were worth fighting publicly, especially when the alternative was allowing competence to be criminalized, simply because it emerged from an unexpected source. Maya left the hotel interview feeling like she'd finally taken control of her own narrative. What she didn't know was that Meridian Financial's response to her public challenge would create exactly the kind of dramatic confrontation that would reveal not just her intellectual courage, but the physical evidence of just how deeply her commitment to uncovering the truth had literally marked her body. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose everything, including secrets that Maya had never intended to share with anyone. Helena Novakova's article appeared in the Prague Financial Times on Thursday morning with a headline that sent shockwave through the Czech business community. "The Accountant Who Saved Millions: How Meridian Financial Ignored Fraud While Prosecuting. The Employee Who Exposed It." The story was devastating in its detail and impossible to dismiss. Helena had confirmed Maya's claims through regulatory documents, interviewed former clients who praised her attention to detail, and obtained statements from investigators who acknowledged that her unauthorized work had been crucial to resolving the fraud case. But more damaging than the facts was the narrative that emerged: a brilliant young professional systematically underestimated and dismissed by superiors who couldn't recognize competence when it didn't fit their expectations. The article portrayed Maya as a dedicated employee whose extraordinary efforts to protect her company had been rewarded with threats of criminal prosecution. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Maya's story resonated with anyone who had ever felt undervalued at work, dismissed by supervisors, or punished for exceeding expectations. Social media exploded with support for the Meridian whistleblower, and financial industry professionals began sharing their own stories of bureaucratic obstacles to reporting misconduct. Maya found herself at the center of a media storm that she was utterly unprepared to handle. Interview requests flooded in from television networks, magazines, and international publications. Professional organizations invited her to speak at conferences, and several prominent law firms offered to represent her pro bono in any legal proceedings against Meridian Financial. But the attention also brought scrutiny that Maya hadn't anticipated. Reporters began investigating her background, interviewing former colleagues, and examining every aspect of her story for inconsistencies or embellishments. Maya discovered that being a public figure meant having every decision and motivation analyzed by people who were determined to find flaws in her account. The pressure intensified when Meridian Financial released a statement defending their personnel decisions and questioning Maya's motives for conducting unauthorized investigations. The company's lawyers began leaking details about Maya's access to confidential information, suggesting that her activities might have violated data protection laws. Regardless of their results, Maya realized that she was fighting a battle on multiple fronts: defending her actions to the media, preparing for potential criminal charges, and trying to maintain her emotional equilibrium while her life was dissected in public. The stress was overwhelming, and she began to understand why many whistleblowers chose silence over the brutal exposure that came with challenging powerful institutions. The crisis reached its peak when Meridian Financial's board of directors called an emergency shareholders meeting to address the scandal that Maya's revelations had created. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday, and Maya learned that she would be called to testify about her unauthorized activities and the evidence she had gathered. Maya spent a week preparing for what she knew would be the most important testimony of her life. She organized her evidence, consulted with lawyers about her legal exposure, and mentally rehearsed answers to the hostile questions she expected to face from board members who viewed her as a threat to corporate stability. But as the meeting approached, Maya began to feel something unexpected, a sense of anticipation rather than dread. For 2 years, she'd been told that she wasn't qualified to analyze financial data, wasn't authorized to identify security threats, and wasn't competent to advise on matters that affected company strategy. Now she would finally have the opportunity to demonstrate the full extent of her capabilities to the people who had dismissed her for so long. The shareholders' meeting was held in Meridian Financial's largest conference room, packed with board members, investors, senior executives, and media representatives who had been granted access to observe the proceedings. Maya sat at a small table facing the board, her documentation organized in neat folders and her laptop displaying the analytical models that had uncovered millions in fraud. Board Chairman Robert Stern called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. "We're here to address allegations made by former employee Maya Ivanova regarding the company's handling of fraud detection and personnel management. Ms. Ivanova, you have 30 minutes to present your evidence and explain your actions." Maya stood up, her heart hammering but her voice steady. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since her first day at Meridian Financial, the chance to prove that competence didn't depend on corporate hierarchy or management approval. "Members of the board," Maya began, "I'm here to explain how I identified systematic fraud that your official systems missed, why I conducted this investigation despite lacking authorization, and what my experience reveals about how this company evaluates and utilizes employee capabilities." As Maya began presenting her evidence, projecting financial models and transaction analyses onto screens visible throughout the room, she noticed something shifting in the atmosphere. The hostile skepticism she'd expected was giving way to something that looked remarkably like amazement. Maya's presentation was methodical, comprehensive, and undeniably impressive. She demonstrated mastery of complex financial concepts, displayed analytical skills that exceeded those of many senior employees, and showed evidence of fraud detection work that had saved the company from regulatory disaster. But Maya also knew that her intellectual demonstration, however impressive, was only the beginning of what she needed to prove. The real test of her commitment, the physical evidence of just how far she'd been willing to go to uncover the truth, remained hidden beneath her professional attire. The moment that would change everything was approaching, and Maya could feel the tension in the room building toward a confrontation that would expose not just her capabilities, but the literal scars that her dedication had left on her body. Maya had been presenting for 25 minutes, methodically dismantling every criticism of her unauthorized investigation while demonstrating analytical capabilities that clearly exceeded those of Meridian Financial's official systems. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as she displayed evidence of millions in recovered funds and regulatory sanctions that her work had prevented. But Thomas Richter, seated in the front row with the other senior analysts, was growing increasingly agitated. Maya's presentation was making him and his entire department look incompetent, and he couldn't tolerate watching a junior accounting clerk receive credit for work that should have been his responsibility. "This is ridiculous," Richter interrupted, standing up abruptly. "We're supposed to believe that Maya Ivanova, with 18 months of experience processing invoices, single-handedly uncovered fraud that our entire analysis department missed? That she somehow developed expertise that exceeds our professional capabilities?" Maya paused her presentation, her hand steady on the laptop, despite the familiar sting of dismissal. "Mr. Richter, the evidence speaks for itself. My analysis identified systematic fraud patterns that your analysis," Richter scoffed, "consists of spreadsheets and theories that any first-year finance student could create. You're not a fraud investigator, Maya. You're an accounting clerk who got lucky with some suspicious patterns and is now trying to present herself as some kind of financial detective." The room buzzed with murmured conversations as board members processed Richter's challenge. Maya felt the mood shifting against her as the familiar narrative reasserted itself. She was too junior, too inexperienced, and too presumptuous to possess the capabilities she claimed. Board Chairman Robert Stern leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Ms. Ivanova, Mr. Richter raises valid concerns. Your presentation is impressive, but it's difficult to believe that someone with your limited Experience could have conducted analysis that our professional staff missed. How do we know you didn't simply get fortunate with a few suspicious transactions? Maya realized that intellectual evidence wasn't enough. No matter how sophisticated her analysis, no matter how accurate her conclusions, she would always be dismissed as someone who had gotten lucky rather than someone who had earned her insights through genuine expertise and dedication. "You want to know how I developed these capabilities?" Maya asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the room fall silent. "You want to understand what qualifies me to conduct this kind of investigation?" Director Klaus Weber sensed danger in Maya's tone. "Ms. Ivanova, I think we should focus on—" "No," Maya interrupted, her composure finally cracking after months of systematic dismissal. "You've questioned my motives, my methods, and my qualifications. You've suggested that I'm either incompetent or criminal, that I'm either lucky or lying. You want proof of my commitment to this work. You want evidence of how far I was willing to go to uncover the truth that all of you missed." Maya reached for the hem of her blouse, her hands trembling slightly but her voice growing stronger. "You want to see what it actually cost me to become the financial investigator that this company desperately needed but refused to recognize?" Thomas Richter stepped forward, alarm replacing his earlier hostility. "Maya, what are you doing? This is completely inappropriate." "What's inappropriate?" Maya replied, pulling her blouse up to expose her lower back. "Is prosecuting someone for this." The room erupted in gasps and shocked silence as Maya revealed what she had hidden beneath her professional attire for months. Her lower back was covered with intricate tattoos that looked like financial flowcharts, transaction diagrams, and mathematical formulas. But these weren't decorative designs. They were detailed maps of the fraud scheme she'd uncovered, permanently inked into her skin as a form of hidden documentation. Maya turned slowly, allowing everyone in the room to see the full extent of what she'd done. Her back displayed a comprehensive visual representation of the Baltic shipping money laundering operation, complete with shell company connections, transaction flows, and timing sequences. The tattoos were clearly the work of a skilled artist, but they were also unmistakably functional, a permanent backup system for evidence that Maya had been terrified of losing. "These tattoos represent 6 months of investigation," Maya said, her voice steady despite the shocked silence filling the room. "Every line, every number, every connection represents hours of analysis that I conducted after my official work was finished. I put this evidence on my body because I knew that someday someone would try to dismiss or destroy my work." Agent Sarah Mueller, who had been observing from the back of the room, stepped forward with professional fascination. "Ms. Ivanova, this is extraordinary. You've created a permanent record of financial crime evidence using your own body as the storage medium?" Maya nodded, lowering her shirt but leaving it untucked so the bottom edge of the tattoos remained visible. "I couldn't risk losing the evidence if my computer was seized or my files were deleted. I needed a backup system that couldn't be taken away from me." Board Chairman Stern stared at Maya with an expression that mixed amazement with something approaching horror. "Ms. Ivanova, you tattooed classified financial information onto your body. Do you understand the security implications of what you've done?" "I understand that I created an unalterable record of crimes that this company's official systems failed to detect," Maya replied. "I understand that I was so committed to protecting Meridian Financial that I permanently marked my body with evidence that could save the company from criminal charges." The room buzzed with urgent conversations as board members, investigators, and executives processed what they'd witnessed. Maya's revelation had transformed her from a dismissed employee into something unprecedented, financial investigator who had literally embodied her commitment to uncovering truth. Thomas Richter sat down heavily, his earlier hostility replaced by stunned silence. Director Weber stared at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. while CEO Victor Brennan consulted urgently with his legal team about the implications of having an employee who carried classified information in tattoo form. But Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the absolute certainty that she had finally proven herself beyond any possibility of dismissal or doubt. Her tattoos weren't just evidence of fraud, they were permanent proof of dedication that exceeded anything her critics could imagine or her supporters could have expected. Agent Mueller approached Maya with professional respect that hadn't been present in their earlier interactions. "Ms. Ivanova, we're going to need to document these tattoos as evidence. This is perhaps the most unusual form of financial documentation I've ever encountered, but it's also remarkably comprehensive." Maya smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. "Agent Mueller, documentation is exactly what I do best. I just found a more permanent way to ensure it couldn't be ignored or dismissed." The room fell silent as everyone processed the full implications of what Maya had revealed. She had transformed herself into a living archive of financial crimes, carrying evidence literally under her skin that proved both her competence and her extraordinary commitment to protecting the company that had consistently undervalued her. The moment of truth had arrived, and Maya had revealed not just her intellectual capabilities, but the physical proof that her dedication exceeded anything anyone in that room could have imagined. The aftermath of Maya's revelation created chaos that lasted for hours. Board members huddled in urgent consultations with lawyers, while investigators photographed and documented the intricate financial tattoos that covered her lower back. Media representatives who had been granted access to observe the meeting frantically contacted their editors about a story that defied every conventional understanding of corporate whistleblowing. Agent Sarah Mueller worked with Maya to create detailed documentation of each tattoo, cross-referencing the inked evidence with the fraud schemes they represented. The tattoos weren't just artistic representations, they were functionally accurate maps of complex financial crimes, complete with account numbers, transaction dates, and subsidiary relationships that Maya had memorized and permanently inscribed on her body. "Ms. Ivanova," Agent Mueller said with genuine admiration, "in 20 years of financial crime investigation, I've never seen documentation this comprehensive or this committed. You've created an unalterable record of evidence that would be impossible to fabricate or manipulate." Maya sat in the conference room as photographers documented her tattoos from every angle, feeling emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. For months, she'd hidden the full extent of her dedication beneath professional clothing and quiet demeanor. Now, everyone could see exactly how far she'd been willing to go to uncover truth that others had missed or ignored. Board chairman Robert Stern approached Maya with an expression that mixed amazement with deep discomfort. "Ms. Ivanova, what you've done is unprecedented, but I need to understand your thinking. Why did you choose such an extreme method of preserving evidence?" Maya's answer was simple and direct. "Because I knew that someday, someone would try to dismiss my work as the product of an unqualified employee who got lucky. I needed proof that couldn't be deleted, destroyed, or attributed to chance. My body was the only storage medium that couldn't be taken away from me. The logic was unassailable, even if the method was shocking." Maya had anticipated every form of dismissal and credibility attack that she might face, and she'd created a defense that was literally impossible to argue against. Her tattoos proved not just the accuracy of her analysis, but the depth of her commitment to protecting Meridian Financial. Thomas Richter, who had been Maya's most vocal critic, sat in stunned silence as he processed what he'd witnessed. His earlier suggestion that Maya was an incompetent employee who had gotten lucky now seemed not just wrong but absurdly inadequate to explain what she'd accomplished. "Maya," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I completely misjudged your capabilities and your dedication. What you've done goes far beyond anything I would have considered possible." Maya nodded graciously, though the acknowledgement felt both validating and insufficient. "Mr. Richter, I never wanted to prove anyone wrong. I just wanted to do work that mattered and have it recognized for what it was." CEO Victor Brennan, who had been consulting with lawyers and investigators throughout the afternoon, finally addressed Maya directly. "Ms. Ivanova, the board has been discussing your situation, and we've reached several conclusions. First, all disciplinary proceedings against you are being dropped immediately. Second, the company owes you both an apology and compensation for the value you've provided." Maya felt a mixture of relief and wariness. Recognition was welcome, but she'd learned to be suspicious of corporate promises that could be easily withdrawn when convenient. "What kind of recognition?" Maya asked. Brennan consulted his notes, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to propose. "The board is prepared to offer you a position as Senior Director of Financial Investigation, reporting directly to the CEO. Your salary would be commensurate with your demonstrated capabilities, and you would have the authority to investigate any accounts or transactions that you consider suspicious." The offer was everything Maya had wanted professionally, but she realized that accepting it would mean returning to an organization that had systematically undervalued her until she'd been forced to take extraordinary measures to prove herself. "Mr. Brennan," Maya said carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand something. Are you offering me this position because you've recognized my capabilities, or because you're afraid of the publicity if you don't?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was still burning. Brennan's expression made it clear that public relations concerns were indeed a significant factor in the board's decision. Agent Mueller, who had been listening to the exchange, stepped forward with a different kind of offer. "Ms. Ivanova, if you're interested, the European Financial Crimes Authority has an opening for a senior forensic analyst. Your unique combination of skills and commitment would be exactly what we need for complex international cases." Maya looked around the conference room at the faces of colleagues who had dismissed her for months, executives who had threatened her with criminal prosecution, and board members who were now scrambling to retain her services. The irony was perfect. The company that had considered her too small and insignificant to handle important work was now desperate to keep her from taking her capabilities elsewhere. "I need time to consider my options," Maya said diplomatically. This has been a revealing day for everyone involved. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out of the conference room, Maya remained seated at her small table, surrounded by the evidence that had finally forced everyone to see her as she truly was. Her tattoos were still partially visible beneath her untucked shirt, permanent reminders of the lengths she'd been willing to go to prove that competence didn't depend on corporate hierarchy or traditional expectations. Director Klaus Weber approached Maya as she packed her materials, his expression showing something that might have been shame. "Maya, I want you to know that I genuinely didn't understand what you were capable of. If I had recognized your abilities earlier, perhaps none of this would have been necessary." Maya looked at Weber with something approaching pity. "Director Weber, the problem wasn't that you didn't recognize my abilities. The problem was that you couldn't imagine that abilities like mine could exist in someone like me. That's a much bigger issue than individual personnel decisions." As Maya left Meridian Financial's headquarters that evening, she realized that her battle hadn't just been about personal recognition. It had been about challenging fundamental assumptions about who could possess expertise, how competence should be demonstrated, and what happened when extraordinary dedication met systematic underestimation. Her tattoos would fade over time, but the message they delivered would endure. Sometimes proving yourself requires measures that exceed everyone's expectations, including your own. 6 months after the shareholders' meeting that changed everything, Maya Ivanova stood in the modern offices of the European Financial Crimes Authority in Brussels, briefing a team of international investigators on a complex money laundering case that spanned 7 countries and involved over 50 million euros in suspicious transactions. Maya had accepted the EFCA position, declining Meridian Financial's desperate counteroffers and the numerous opportunities that had emerged after. Her story became international news. The decision had been easy once she realized that she wanted to work for an organization that valued competence over conformity, results over protocols, and innovative thinking over traditional hierarchies. Her new role as senior forensic analyst came with resources that Maya had never imagined having access to: a team of junior investigators, cutting-edge analytical software, and the authority to pursue cases wherever the evidence led. More importantly, it came with colleagues who appreciated rather than feared her unconventional approaches to financial investigation. The tattoo documentation proved crucial in establishing the timeline. Maya explained to her team, displaying the case evidence on wall-mounted screens. We were able to trace the original fraud patterns and connect them to similar schemes in other jurisdictions. Maya's tattoos had become legendary in financial crime investigation circles, though she rarely discussed them publicly. They'd been professionally photographed and archived as part of the Meridian financial case, and the images were now used in training programs as an example of innovative evidence preservation. Maya had become known as the investigator who was literally committed to her work, though she discouraged the celebrity aspect of her reputation. The professional recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most to Maya was the work itself. At EFCA, she investigated cases that affected millions of people, tracked criminal networks that operated across continents, and developed analytical methods that were being adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide. Her pattern recognition skills and systems thinking approach were exactly what international financial crime investigation required. Maya's success had also changed how she was perceived in professional circles. She received speaking invitations from universities, consulting offers from major corporations, and requests for media interviews that she typically declined. The quiet accounting clerk, who had once been dismissed as too small and insignificant, had become one of Europe's most respected financial crime investigators. But Maya's real satisfaction came from the changes her story had inspired in other organizations. Companies across Europe had begun reviewing their talent recognition processes, examining whether they were overlooking valuable capabilities in unexpected places. Several firms had created programs specifically designed to identify and develop employees whose abilities exceeded their job descriptions. Maya received letters regularly from employees who had been inspired by her example to pursue unauthorized projects that had led to significant discoveries or improvements in their organizations. Her story had become a case study in business schools and management programs, illustrating both the costs of systematic underestimation and the potential benefits of encouraging initiative that exceeded traditional boundaries. The most meaningful correspondence came from young professionals who saw Maya's example as proof that competence could emerge from anywhere and that dedication could overcome institutional dismissal. Maya tried to respond to these letters personally, offering encouragement while cautioning that extraordinary measures should be reserved for extraordinary circumstances. Maya's relationship with Meridian Financial had evolved into something resembling mutual respect. The company had implemented new procedures for recognizing and developing employee capabilities, and they occasionally consulted with Maya on complex cases that required her specialized expertise. The antagonism had faded, replaced by professional collaboration that benefited everyone involved. Thomas Richter, who had been Maya's harshest critic, had actually become one of her most valuable professional contacts. His experience with traditional analysis methods complemented Maya's innovative approaches, and they'd collaborated successfully on several international cases. Their working relationship had demonstrated that competence could be recognized and valued even after initial misjudgments. On a sunny afternoon in Brussels, Maya stood in her office reviewing the latest case files while her team prepared for a complex investigation in the Balkans. Through her window, she could see the European Parliament building and the bustling streets of an international district where decisions were made that affected millions of people. Maya's tattoos remained hidden beneath her professional attire, though she occasionally wore clothing that revealed the edges of her intricate financial documentation. They served as permanent reminders of the lengths she'd been willing to go to prove that competence didn't depend on conventional expectations or traditional hierarchies. The quiet accounting clerk who had once processed invoices in a cramped Prague cubicle had become a leader in international financial crime investigation. But more importantly, Maya had proven that extraordinary dedication could overcome systematic dismissal, that competence could emerge from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most valuable employees were the ones who refused to accept the limitations that others had placed on them. As Maya prepared to brief the Attorney General on her latest investigation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from accounts payable to international law enforcement. The path had been unconventional, the methods had been extreme, and the costs had been significant. But Maya had achieved something that transcended personal success. She had demonstrated that talent could emerge from anywhere, and that dedication could overcome any form of institutional dismissal. Maya picked up her briefcase and headed toward the Attorney General's office, ready to present evidence that would protect millions of euros and bring international criminals to justice. Her tattoos were hidden beneath her suit, but the message they represented was permanently visible in everything she accomplished. Competence doesn't depend on other people's expectations, and sometimes proving yourself requires measures that exceed everyone's imagination. The quiet girl from accounting had become exactly what she'd always been capable of being. She'd just finally found an organization that could recognize what she had to offer. And that recognition had changed not just Maya's life, but the lives of everyone who had witnessed what happened when extraordinary dedication met systematic underestimation. The story that had begun with dismissal and doubt had ended with recognition and respect. Maya Ivanova had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept the limitations that others have placed on you, even if proving it requires measures that literally leave permanent marks. Her tattoos would fade over time, but the example she'd set would endure. Competence doesn't ask permission. Dedication doesn't wait for authorization. And sometimes changing the world requires being willing to mark yourself permanently with the evidence that others refused to see. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.